Now let's look at second language learning now and see how the brain utilizes two different languages. Second language learning affects the way the brain's organized for language. It's actually a very good thing to have a second language. You probably know that. But it differs dependent upon when the second language is learned. And also, there is this critical period of development that is going to require about the same length of time, whether a child is going to learn language early in life or whether they're going to learn it later. It takes a certain amount of time to be able to master a second language. And so to get started, let's look at the research of Dr. Joy Hirsch. She's at Columbia University. And several years ago, this is almost 20-year-old data now, she looked at adults who had learned a second language after they were school age. So we call that after the critical period of learning a language because it's usually around 6 or 7 years of age. So after they entered school or before they entered school. And we would call that during the critical period. And you can see on the left, you see after the critical period, you see that they have two languages that are represented in this language area of the brain that we call Broca's area. That area of the brain, you can see there's a red section and a yellow section, and those two are clearly separated. And what that means is that when a child is learning, or when any of us learn a second language, after we enter school, the two languages are stored separately and utilized separately. So the individual is always going to translate from their native language into the second language, and that takes time. And it also is going to take time to carve out that region of the brain and build it up for the second language. Now, on the right side, you see what happens if someone's exposed to a second language before they enter school. In those cases, they're called true bilinguals because the whole language area overlaps. Most of it's orange, meaning that they don't have to translate. They just have one big, giant language that contains the set of phonemes from speech sounds from one language, set of speech sounds from the other language, all the vocabulary of the two languages, and they can go back and forth between the two. They can switch between the two very easily and think in both languages. Now, for most of us, our students are going to be learning the second language after they enter school. They might have been exposed to it on television, but one of the things we know is that television doesn't really build language skills very well. But the brain is wired for language, and learning language is the way the whole left hemisphere starts to mature in all literate societies. So at birth, we have this equal potential to learn any language. I'm sure you all know that. But by 5 to 6 months, the brain has already started to specialize for the language that the child is exposed to in the home. And if both parents speak Spanish or both parents speak the same language, that is the language that the brain's going to wire itself for. And then what we start doing is creating maps in the brain. The human brain, once it gets exposed to any language, starts building a map. You can kind of think of that as almost like a piano keyboard, where you have separate, each key of the keyboard has a different tone. Well, in the map, and you'll see that again in a minute, but in this particular slide, you can see this was research done by Mesgarani et al., published in the journal Science just a couple of years ago. And what they did is they actually created that using an electrode. They could test for every single sound, every single speech sound of English, and determine where on this part of the brain that you see that's red, where on the temporal lobe that particular speech sound was being processed. And what that means is then you have this brain that develops its capacity to perceive the sounds of the native language. Then the brain is going to link those sounds to meaningful words and learn grammar and build up those capacities that we think of as language. And it's very hierarchical.